this last conversation, really, it's from Working Group last night. And it is a story that kind of slid by me because this is from 2 days ago. Critics doubt government claims 1,000 children now in homes, not emergency housing. Getting more than 1,000 children into homes and out of motels is just the start of drastically reducing emergency housing, the government says. But a housing advocate said cutting down on emergency housing simply means more families homeless and living out of cars, and the Labour Party said the government was making it harder for families in need to access emergency housing. Associate Minister of Housing Tama Potaka says new figures show a 32% reduction in the number of families living in motels, as we were talking about earlier to sorry, my brain just went blank, didn't it? To Ricardo. When you change how you count, it's easy to tutu around with results, isn't it? And that more than 1,000 children have been rehoused in homes by Kāinga Ora or community organisations since the government came to power. Potaka said there have been a snowballing problem where families were staying in emergency housing long term when it had been intended as a stopgap for brief periods. That meant children were growing up in motels, and he had heard stories of families having to move to 8 different hotels in 2 years, which caused major disruption for their children. Later on, we hear from a housing advocate. Canterbury housing advocate Kevin Murray said need for emergency housing was growing, and that's not what the government's telling us, due to the high price of rents. There's going to be more and more people put back out onto the streets. There's going to be more families living out of cars. That's the reality of the government's decisions. The reality was that housing providers need more money to build more houses. Last week, Murray told RNZ people in emergency housing had reported they were living in fear of eviction because of anticipated tough new rules for people using the service. Finally, Labour Party housing spokesperson Kieran McAnulty said the reduction in number of people in emergency housing was because it had been made too hard for families to access when they need it. I've got this picture in my head. You know, you see all those like American fairy tales, and they're always cooking an apple pie and leaving it on the windowsill. You know, every time they do it, the windowsill and the apple pie gets stolen. Well, what they do is they put their windowsill 40 feet in the air, and all of a sudden, apple pies aren't being stolen. So if they change what's happening, if they change it, if they make it harder to get to the apple pie, then all of a sudden the apple pies aren't being stolen. If they're making it harder to get into the emergency housing, then all of a sudden the numbers look so much better. Make it harder for people to get into emergency housing. Where are they going to go? They're certainly not going to the houses that the government are building, because the government put a stop to that. They're either going into cars, which is why emergency housing was created in the first place, or they're going to go and stay with family in overcrowded conditions. They'll be able to reach that 75% because they're not letting people in. It's unhealthy. It's like, you imagine you had a stadium that could fit 10,000 people and you went, we're going to reduce the number in the stadium by 25%, and you just stopped at 7,500 and didn't let anyone else in. You would have reached your target, but it doesn't mean the demand would be any different. They'll be able to reach that 75% because they're not letting people in. It's unhealthy and unsafe, and only real honest way to reduce demand is by funding social housing. More questions needed to be asked about where people do go instead, McAnulty said. Now, last night on the, this is where I actually learned about it, on the working group, they had a bit of a chat about this. And it's always fascinating to see Damien Grant have no answer to a question. But let's have a look at what they had to say about it last night. Where are the 1,000 kids, Tama? Where are the 1,000 kids?
Quick round. This government excels at camouflaging social carnage and selling that shit sandwich.
I like the idea of camouflaging. In other words, it's not gone. It's just painted to fade into the background so it's harder to see. It's a great turn of phrase by Bonner.
to us as a Parisian pastry. We have Associate Minister of Housing Tama Potaka claiming to have waved his homeless children wand and magically 1,000 children aren't in emergency housing in 1 month. Is it because Tama is a magician, or is it because National radically reshaped the eligibility for emergency housing and have in fact just ended up dumping these kids out into the street? Damien Grant.
I don't know the answer to that. I think you are looking at an extremely obscure point and trying to score political.
In 1 month,
points.
1,000 children moved out of emergency housing. Really? Where'd they go?
I don't
Magic
know.
Land?
Why don't we ask him on the podcast?
Oh, we're trying to get him on, but he wants to duck and dive these days.
And I'll see whether I can get him on.
1,000.
It's a very good point being made here that we've kind of mentioned a couple of times tonight throughout the conversations. Is what this government's doing is they are changing the way you count things, and they're changing the way you count things, and then the outputs they're going to be able to say, well, we did this. Well, yeah, that's because you're now only counting people above 6 foot. What about all those ones below 6 foot that you made sure were in the situation when Labour was in? So if they change the way they record various stats and data, they get to choose what the outcome of those stats and data will be.
Children suddenly moved out of emergency housing. Really?
Might be a good story. Perhaps he moved them into social housing. Do you know?
Actually, it's funny you say that. He did sort of say, social housing, but then they admitted that they're not actually building any more social housing. Right. It looks like, and this is what the advocates have said, they've just been thrown out onto the street.
Oh, come on. Are you saying that there is 1,000...
That's what happened. That's happened.
There is
with
1,000 children living under a bridge. That is absolute.
Where are they? Where are they?
No, they'll go back. They'll go back into 3 families living in one house,
right.
Which is exactly what happened. And when there was an availability of, they said go out and you'll get it. And we'll have our house back and go back and you'll get some emergency housing. But look, and this is the one, this is this government, try not to be too political. This is one thing that National actually excel at, is change the rules.
Yeah, this is good. Listen up. Again, what are they good at? Changing the rules. Changing the way they record data. They change it.
One thing that National actually excel at is change the rules. We saw it with the waiting lists.
Yep.
Remember back, if you were on a waiting list for 6 months, you fell off. And that was how Tony Royal managed. He did a great job of waiting lists. You watch the gang numbers go down because they're going to redefine what's a gang number. All of these things that Christopher Luxton has said we are going to do, they will do them. Nothing will change, but what will happen is the definition will change. And this is another one. These kids know they're not under bridges. They're back in houses where 3 families are living in one place. That's exactly where they've gone, because that woman who I talked about, who had, quite smart, had said, look, go out and you will get the social housing available, go and get it. Well, now you're out, a motel, you're back in, she is going to be now feeding 15 more mouths. That's what's going to happen. And we will all pay the consequence. Not now, we'll pay the consequence in about 5 years, because they won't go to school. Oliver, they should, but they won't be.
Which is another reason why we need to return to the social investment.
Until we change those, but be very wary. And look, this is one that I really never forgave the Nats for the last time. They just will change the definitions. And Oliver, your group should be watching this. You should be the watchdog for this to say, are we comparing apples with apples? Because I tell you what, we won't be.
It does appear that, from Brett Hudson's giving me the good oil. Apparently, these people have been moved back into or been reallocated into social housing. So this is an accounting exercise, and just you have gone down some internet rabbit hole. I think I found one news story on some weird Australian site. This is not a story, Bomber. Move on.
And that's where we're going to leave it and move on. Only time we will ever listen to the advice of Damien Grant. Time to move on.